Good afternoon to everybody. Thank you very much for joining us for this webinar that is going to tackle the impact of the U.S. election on Canada, the risk and challenges of unpredictable outcome. I'm sure many of you have had a chance to watch the debate or not to watch the debate last night. There's significant uncertainty in the relationship between Canada and the United States since for the past 4 years. The current election is going to determine how the future of this relationship will go forward or not. Are we going to see more of the same? Are we going to see more drastic changes and so on and so forth? And this is why we have today with us our three panelists that are expert in questions that range from NAFTA and trade partnership to foreign policy making and the Arctic, or the NORAD and NATO security cooperation and so on between the United States and Canada. Because I will forget otherwise, before I present our three panelists today, I want to remind everybody of the format. We are going to be having an hour and a half discussion. The first hour is going to be our three panelists answering in very conversation style questions and debating the current situation and the move forward. And then afterwards, we're going to have a 30 minutes Q&A where the audience will be able to ask questions. And for this, if you look at the bottom right of your screen, you have three dots menu. If you click on this, then you'll have the option for Q&A. So please, you'll be able to write your questions there, and I will then ask them on the panelists. What I need to ask you is to make sure when you send the question that you send it to all of the panelists. But you'll see the option of doing it individually. Please do not. Please use the option to send to all of the panelists. So without further ado, let me introduce you to our panelists today. First, I'd like to introduce Meredith Olivier, who is at NIPSIA Carleton University at the moment. She's the Associate Professor and holder of the Simon Reisman Chair in International Affairs at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs. She's a national award-winning researcher with extensive experience in public policy development and executive branch decision-making. She's had numerous governmental positions, including foreign affairs and international trade advisor to Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper, and she oversaw within the Prime Minister's office the conclusion of Canada's free trade negotiation with the European Union, South Korea, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, among other files. She currently serves as Associate Director of the MA program at NIPSIA, and her research focuses on international labor mobility and the Canada-U.S. trade relations. Meredith, thank you very much for being with us today. We have, equally with us, we have Dr. Brian Bowe, who is a professor of political science and still the director of the Center for Study of Security and Development at Dalhousie University. His research covers Canadian foreign policy and questions of defense policy, Canada-U.S. relations, cross-border policy. Cross-border policy, I'm sorry, I lost my thread of thought. Cross-border policy coordination through bureaucratic network. Here I am. I've heard that there's a lawnmower somewhere. Domestic politics of international trade and regional integration, particularly in North America. You may know him best as the author of The Politics of Linkage, Power, Interdependence, and Ideas in Canada-U.S. Relations, which was awarded the Donor Prize, which is the prize for best book in public policy published in Canada. Brian, thank you for being with us today. And last but not least, I'd like to welcome Andrea Charon. She holds a PhD from the Royal Military College of Canada in the Department of War Studies. She's currently her research focuses. She's currently at the University of Associate Professor at the University of Manitoba. Thank you very much. Her research and teaching includes areas such as NORAD, the Arctic, foreign and defense policy, and sanctions. She serves on Canada's Department of National Security's Defense Advisory Board and has published in numerous peer-reviewed journals. Previously, Dr. Sharon worked for various federal departments, including the Privy Council Office in the Security Intelligence Secretariat and Canada's Revenue Agency. She's currently the director of the Center for Defense and Security Studies at the University of Manitoba as well. Andrea, thank you very much for being with us today. I think, especially for the one part of the uncertainty in the relationship between Canada and the United States has been linked to trade. And it's mostly been linked to which the U.S. have been imposing protectionist, have been going more towards protectionist measures and so on. We can think very easily to the recent, in August, there was the threat levied against Canada to impose tariffs on certain aluminum products. Canada retorted with, if I remember correctly, which was a threat of 2.7 billion threat in retaliation. We've learned recently in September that the United States were not going to go ahead with this. But I think that the question lingers, should we expect, Meredith, should we expect more of the same if Trump-Pence administration is re-elected? Can we expect something different in the case of a Biden administration? Or is there anything in translation here that we're missing that we need to put on the table to understand better?
Thanks for the question, Jean-Francois. Yeah, so I think certainly the trade relationship has been a pretty difficult one over the last 4 years. If Donald Trump is reelected, yes, I do expect sort of a doubling down of the current strategy. But in some ways, his unpredictability has become predictable. So I do think that we have developed as Canadians kind of a bit of an understanding about how he operates. And so I don't actually expect a huge change. And if anything, I think perhaps he might cast his net a little bit wider, and in terms of not necessarily focusing on Canada so much now that the NAFTA deal has been negotiated. But as a result of that very negative relationship that we've had over the last few years, the Canadian government spent a lot of time working with other levels of government. So working to create stronger relationships with individual representatives in Congress, both in the House and the Senate, with state governors, with business leaders and business associations, and even to some extent, mayors of large cities. And so I think if Trump is to remain in power, Canada will, to some extent, just recognize that the relationship with the White House is something of a broken one, and will continue to work through those channels that we've now developed. In the case of a Biden win, I think we'll continue to rely on that network, and we do have to keep that network kind of alive, because I think we now recognize we're in a new game with the Americans, even if Biden is elected. But certainly, I think there's much more of a kind of natural affinity between the two leaders. They will agree in a number of areas, progressive politics, climate. And so I think we'll have a much more predictable relationship, and actually, you know, not always having grenades lobbed at us through social media, I think can actually make a difference in terms of the overall perception of the relationship. Having said that, Joe Biden's platform is very protectionist. He has rolled out a platform, a Buy America platform, that seeks to, you know, do the same things that Donald Trump wanted to do: buy American, hire American. But he's also actually specified some things within his platform that will actually be quite damaging to trade interests between our two countries. So, for instance, he has articulated a desire to close loopholes in Buy America procurement, and has stated very clearly some goals around electric vehicles being made in the United States, which potentially threatens our supply chain on autos. He's also talked about, specifically in his platform, renegotiating trade rules with partners and allies in order to get us all to spend money in our own countries. So these kinds of messages are actually quite alarming to me as a trade expert, because they sound like support for subsidies, which would be ruled illegal in the international trade rules. It sounds like wanting to kind of unwind some of our integrated North American supply chain. And so I would say that if Biden is elected, on trade, the Trudeau government and his team are really going to have to work hard during that transition period to ensure that the trade relationship with Canada remains strong, that some of the damage under the Trump administration is undone, and that prior to being inaugurated, we've impressed upon his officials the reasons that we'd rather be sort of inside that American tent, that North American tent of supply chain integration, rather than potentially end up getting sideswiped on some of his trade policies towards China and that kind of thing.
Thank you very much. And just a quick follow-up: how successful have we been with connecting with more state and city level actors?
So we have been, our federal officials and also provincial officials have done a great deal over the last few years to kind of set up this network and reinforce these relationships. And we've done a lot more of that as time has gone on. But something that I always say is that, you know, Americans have the most influence on the president and the White House in terms of their interests. And so while we've created these relationships and we've reinforced them, Americans on the other side of the border are primarily interested in the United States. And so they need to see what's in it for them. I don't think that, you know, regardless of how good the relationship is, naked self-interest is going to prevail with them. And so, you know, just being nice to the Canadians in order to be nice to the Canadians, I think the time for that is over. And so I think we have worked hard on that, but continuing to make the case for why having good relations with Canada serves American interests is actually what we have to continue to do.
Thank you very much. So we've had the primer on trade. Let's go and get the primer on military and defense cooperation. Andrea, a very similar question to open the floor a bit. What can we expect in the Canadian-U.S. defense partnership with a continuation of the Trump administration versus a Biden win, right? Are we going again to see plausible alteration to the current doctrine, or alternatively, are we going to go somewhere completely different with a Biden-Harris administration?
Well, thank you very much for the invitation and the question, Jean-François. I think one of the reasons why the Canada-U.S. defense relationship is so special is because it has managed to sort of hover above any of the political machinations over the years. And this is not the first time that presidents and prime ministers have not seen eye to eye. We think, you know, still the nadir was when we had Diefenbaker and Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, those two men absolutely hated each other. And yet the military, because of the terms of reference, because of the embeddedness and the plug and play nature that we have with the US military, it just tends to go on doing its business. Now, I think what we will see is if Trump is elected, this continued sort of antagonism and hostility towards allies. With Biden, however, he is still going to expect, as have successive presidents, that allies do more to protect Western ways of living. And so that's not going to change. I think the difference is, though, that Biden will be a little bit more reassuring. And so I think the attention will turn to NATO much more. Especially, I expect one of the first phone calls that Biden will make will be to NATO allies to assure them that the U.S. firmly believes in NATO and will be there to help them. That being said, Canada is in a bit of a new position when it comes to the difference between how North America sees military threats today because of great power politics and how Europe sees it. And Canada could be caught a little bit in the middle. Under the current Trump administration, there's been concerted focus on protecting the homeland and sort of a retrenchment from collective security-like actions, you know, this need to withdraw from the Middle East and from Afghanistan and other places and really put quote unquote America first. Canada, via the relationship we have with NORAD, is very much a part of that, and certainly our military has been thinking about how we can modernize NORAD with the United States to ensure that North America is protected. Europeans, on the other hand, they certainly see Russia as a threat, but they have other concerns such as terrorism and the instability that is created when you have massive movement of people, when we think of the migration from North Africa coming into Southern Europe. And that for Europeans are concerns that they expect NATO to assist with. I think that what we might see with Biden is rather than focusing simply on collective defense, a tendency to also focus on these other stabilization and crisis management operations. But we may find then as Canada badly overstretched when we consider that 50% of our operations now are in aid to the civilian authorities, things like flood, fire assistance during the pandemic. If we have a Biden administration who is very keen to take on collective security everywhere in the world, this could leave us badly overstretched.
Thank you. And maybe it's putting you on the hot seat. Do you think NATO survives another 4 years of a Trump administration, given that you seem to be kind of positive that Biden will shift back to collective security?
Well, I would unpack those two because I think there are two aspects to this. I mean, the demise of NATO has been declared since its foundation. So that's not new. And, you know, when we think about Macron's statement on the 70th anniversary of NATO saying that it's brain dead, you know, we thought, if anything, when a US president comes in and threatens to pull out of NATO, that, if anything, sort of represents when NATO was at its most vulnerable. I think NATO will continue, but there will be this increasing tension about what is it that NATO should be doing. At its core is its collective defense mission, but over time, and because we lacked near and peer competitors, NATO got into the business of stabilization and crisis management. Now that we have near and peer competitors, Russia and especially China, looming in the background, NATO now has to reorient itself and decide collectively what it is they're going to focus on and perhaps what they're going to let go. And this is made much more difficult because we now have 30 member states, each of which essentially have a veto. And that divide between how the US sees threats to the world versus Europe, I don't see changing whether we have Trump or Biden. It's something that NATO as an alliance is going to have to sort out.
Oh, I should unmute myself. Thank you very much. So we've had the view on the Canada-U.S. security relationship and the Canada-U.S. Trade relationship, but an important question then becomes the election and whether we're going to get going. And I would like to turn this question to you, Brian. It's been everywhere. We've heard about this so much. How likely are we to see a contestation of the results of the current election? Under which circumstances would we see it? And what do you expect the outcome of this to be? And why?
Thanks, Jeff, and thanks also for the invitation. I mean, I guess the short answer to the question is there will definitely be contestation of the result, pretty much no matter what the result is. And the big question is, what form does that contestation take? And is it sort of contained, or does it sort of spiral into like much more serious problems? Given the way the polling is going so far, every indication is that Biden, is sort of statistically likely to win, and unless there is tampering. And there's been so much evidence of voter suppression and so much signaling of an unwillingness to accept a loss on the part of Trump and his proxies that everyone is sort of keyed up with the expectation that the only way, if the results seem to show him winning, it must be because he's cheated. And he seems to have sort of deliberately kind of almost encouraged that perception by, essentially pretending the polls don't matter and raising questions about his willingness to defer. So all of these things have voters on the left and in the center kind of keyed up to expect trouble. And therefore, if the result seems to be going to Trump's way, then they're going to be suspicious, and that's going to lead to street protests and kind of a reflexive impulse to contest the result no matter what happens. And on the other side, Trump has made it clear that he doesn't believe it's possible for him to lose, and that if he does seem to be losing, then that must mean the election is rigged against him. And he has also signaled his willingness to contest it, either through a court process or through a political process, or both. And when I say a political process, I mean state legislatures essentially sort of calling an end to the count at a certain point, and often the most likely scenario is that on the end of election night, if it looks like ballots up to that point are tilting Trump's way, there will be some states where there's going to be a desire to kind of cut things off and say there are questions about the legitimacy of mail-in votes. There seems to be a clear result here. We're going to kind of call it at this point. I think a lot of it is sort of raising expectations about that, but there aren't a whole lot of state legislatures who are really keen to actually do that, I think. So then the more likely thing is that we get a result more like 2000, where there's contestation over, if it's close vote, there's contestation over the result of one or two states, and then it goes to the courts, and then, all bets are off. And given the composition of the court now, it seems likely that that would tilt to Trump, and then that in itself would lead to a kind of intense political challenge that would come afterwards. So I'm very concerned about sort of three kinds of a political challenge where sort of the normal political processes are circumvented, a court challenge where people are unhappy with the result and it seems illegitimate afterwards, as in 2000, and then also contestation on the streets, where people are protesting what they see as a rigged system. And here, I mean, people on both sides of the political divide. And I'm quite worried about the prospect for that to lead to street violence, police crackdowns, and that triggering vigilante violence like we've seen in the last few months. So that there's plenty of potential for those things that it's almost inevitable that those things will happen. The big question is, will they spiral out of control?
Can you, just a quick follow-up?
Yeah.
Assuming that your second case happened and we have a court contestation of the result, can you kind of run us into how long you expect this to take, and what happens on January 21st, 2021, if the court case is not done with? Assuming, for example, a slim win by the Biden camp.
Okay, so the count seems to go to Biden, but there's that's sort of being challenged in the courts afterwards. Is that what you mean? I mean, what we saw in 2000 is that there's no reason for that court process to not be resolved by January, right? So it almost certainly would be worked out by then, but that's still plenty of time for all kinds of trouble, right? So I'm not worried about us reaching kind of moment of uncertainty in late January 2021. What I'm worried about is that there is a time when Trump is still in office. It seems like the vote has gone against him, but he is challenging that and he's sort of waiting on the court result. And we're not even 100% sure that a clear court decision going against him would necessarily dislodge him. So, yeah, I think I'm not worried about the particular scenario you're talking about, but I think there's 100 other ways that things could go bad.
That's very reassuring. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sorry, you cannot count on me to be reassuring today. That's not happening.
Well, and then, all right, let's pivot a little bit to what is probably the elephant in the room that everybody is wondering about is the continued effect of COVID is been having on the economy, but also on military relation and so on and so forth. And first, I would like to turn the question to Meredith. Well, first, could you just give us kind of a general appraisal of the current difficulty on trade and border relations that COVID has brought to the Canadian-U.S. relationship, and then bring us a step forward and in thinking how these will unfold in the next 4 years, depending on who is in office, right? Whether a continuation of Trump policies or an arrival of Biden and Harris in the White House, or also a shift in Congress, right? So let's say that Senate moves more Democrat and so on and so forth.
Sure. Yeah, I actually think that the COVID issue, just like it's dominating all of our lives on our virtual lecture or virtual webinar, is what's going to continue to dominate the Canada-U.S. relationship as well. So, right now the border remains closed. This is something that keeps getting renewed on a monthly basis jointly by both governments. So it's closed other than for essential travel. Business travel is permitted, and then some narrow compassionate travel categories as well around family reunification and that kind of thing. The 14-day quarantine remains in effect. And so that piece actually puts a real damper on business travel. And it's less of an issue, I think, for bilateral trade relations that are already well established, but certainly this is not the time. If you're thinking about getting into exporting to the United States, now is not the time, right? So the border issues really means that until this is all over, status quo is kind of the best we can hope for. Definitely, we're seeing some supply chain disruption. So although trade in goods is allowed to go back and forth, I think we've all experienced supply chain interruptions when you go to a store and want to buy something and they say, oh, it's COVID. And we know that we've had a real drop in bilateral trade, but that is, with other countries as well. It is rebounding. I think some of it is quite sector specific. But, the good news is that fresh fruits and vegetables are still coming across the border. Essential supplies are still coming across, and we make toilet paper in Canada, so that's a good thing. So in terms of a change in government, I think under one issue that is relevant to the comments that Brian just made is around a contested election. I think to some extent keeping the border closed certainly is the responsible thing to do and is what Canadians want, but there's no doubt in my mind that some of the reason that Canadians want the border to remain closed is because of the general unrest we're seeing in the United States and a real antipathy towards the Trump administration. And I don't want to underplay the COVID piece of this, but a real lack of faith in the way that the COVID pandemic is being managed in the United States, in my mind, certainly is playing into this. And so, under a continuing Trump presidency, I'm confident that the border will open eventually, but I think it will take longer. Under a contested election result, I wouldn't be surprised if we continue to use COVID as a good reason to keep the border closed until everything is sorted out in the United States. It seems like a good way to maintain cover without the Canadian government needing to comment specifically on whatever we might see happening south of the border. And then finally, if there's a clear Biden result, I don't think that we should expect the border to open overnight. He won't take power until January. I don't actually think, regardless of what he does, I don't think that the pandemic and the way it's been handled in the United States is going to change overnight. Once the genie's out of the bottle, it's going to take some time. And so I think it's a long way off before this situation improves in the United States. And, you know, back to what I said before, Canadians generally are quite happy keeping the border closed. And so I don't expect anything to change immediately or even necessarily in the next 3 months, say. I do believe the border will reopen eventually, but that may be because rates have gone down considerably, vaccines are available, and the threat really from the United States has declined to the point that all of the disadvantages of having the border closed override our interests in avoiding COVID arriving more strongly from the south.
Thank you. Andrea, I'd like to turn to you too. So right now we've dealt with about 3 very important topics in the U.S.-Canada relationship. The one that has been suspiciously missing up till now has been climate change, and it has been brought to the attention of everyone last night in the last debate. Given your expertise, what I'm particularly curious about is, if you speak to anyone near or close the military, they'll tell you that the main threat in the future, outside of geopolitical threats, being Russia or China, is climate change in itself becoming very important. We've seen 4 years of the Trump administration kind of not handling this side of the equation too well. Is this something that you expect to continue? And more importantly, as the changes keep creeping up, are we going to, will the military then be in a position maybe to force the discussion a bit more, maybe more than they're accustomed to be doing? And flip side of this is, if we see an election of Biden, should we expect a 180 on certain of these policies, or are we going to see something more gradual, and so on and so forth?
Okay, just a small question. So I think both militaries, the Canadian and the U.S. military, recognize that climate change is a big issue. And even though climate change, specifically that wording, is sort of discouraged in official military doctrine of late, you see it everywhere. The fact that, for example, the Department of the U.S. Air Force has released its first ever Arctic strategy is proof that they are thinking deeply about the effects of climate change. But Cullen Hendricks wrote a recent article in War on the Rocks, and he said that how militaries think about climate change is starting to shift. So militaries tend to focus on what he calls the wolves, those immediate threats with high lethality, and that's what they focus on. And that's not necessarily climate change, which he says is more like termites. It just eats away, and all of a sudden everything is falling apart, and you can't say when was the precipitating moment to have done something. So the militaries are not in a mandate to mitigate climate change. They're always responding to it. And we see this on both sides of the border. US NORTHCOM, which is our Canadian Joint Operations Command equivalent, both of them are spending more and more time and resources on dealing with these climate change events, floods, fires, helping to shovel out Newfoundland. And this is going to continue to increase. We know storms are going to become more lethal, more unpredictable. And this has all sorts of implications in terms of training, equipment, things like increased demands for search and rescue, and this domestic operation role to increase. And I don't see that changing. This is, again, a nonpartisan issue. Climate change doesn't care who's in charge. And so it comes down again to balancing. I think under Biden, he hopefully will allow the military to actually talk about climate change. It is a force multiplier and also detractor. We know that infrastructure is badly affected by climate change, and then that limits the ability of the military to finish their operations, to launch their operations in all sorts of contexts. So I think a Biden win will make it easier to talk about climate change. It won't be this elephant in the room that you can't acknowledge and somehow have to try and work around. It's things like putting in place individuals with the expertise and the know-how to actually talk about climate change, as opposed to under Trump, the very partisan appointments with people who have no idea what climate change entails and really, frankly, don't want to do anything about it. And so I think it's just going to make the military's role easier, because we can actually call a spade a spade. Climate change is everywhere. It's going to affect everything we do. It is a force multiplier. We cannot ignore it.
Thank you. I just want to make a very quick point. I'm seeing hands in the chat. Questions are going to be held at the end of the talk. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom right beside the chat icon to write your question, and we will get to them in about 20 to 25 minutes. So then I'd like to return to Brian, mostly moving from Andrew's dire warning to your own dire warning of potential street violence and so on, following the election. So first, you elaborated a little bit of what you expect could happen, but I would like to hear your thought a bit more about the types of conflict and how it would happen, but more importantly, what it would mean for Canada at every steps in these potential scenarios, right? The ways in which we expect the Trudeau government to handle this, for example, in case of, as you mentioned, violence in the street, and what does it mean, especially for cooperation that we have with the Americans on border control or on law enforcement cooperation, for example.
Okay. So, I mean, there are really two different things to figure out. One is sort of understanding what will happen in the U.S., and then the second thing is what implications does that have for Canada in managing the bilateral relationship. And I think in terms of what could happen, I actually think that the prospects for street violence and sort of knock-on violence to follow from it are much more intense if Trump wins, particularly if it's a contested election. Not so much because of Trump himself, but because it's more likely that if he wins, that will trigger street protests on a much larger scale. And those street protests, having people out on the street is the main thing that creates the potential for much larger kind of action-reaction cycles for violence sort of escalating. And the real worrisome thing is, I mean, obviously I'm worried about the consequences of kind of clashes between the police and protesters, but the bigger issue is kind of catalyzing vigilante movements, so the militia groups and other right-wing groups that I mean, you remember there was the kidnapping plot to kidnap the governor of Michigan, and there have been a variety of other sort of small-scale, what you might call sort of backyard terrorism things, where a few people have been radicalized online or locally come up with a wild scheme to sort of take the law into their own hands. And we know for sure these things will happen. What we don't know is how much of them, or where or when. They're almost random in where and when they occur. And the big question is going to be whether these stop just being isolated incidents and whether there's a dynamic where one action sort of triggers a reprisal of some kind and then it sort of escalates. And that could be conflict between different groups, societal groups on the street, or it could be sort of the law enforcement versus some of these groups and sort of back and forth. But it's worth noting that some of these groups, specifically the Boogaloo Boys and some of these other groups, are specifically target the police as the enemy, and that could also contribute to this kind of back and forth problem. And there are a variety of different ways that this could create issues for Canada. I mean, the most obvious one is the question of sort of recognizing the government if there's a contested election. And I think we already get, without putting too much thought into it, that we need to be careful and not involve ourselves in any of those kinds of things. But there may be moments where, if it's pushed to a sort of farther extreme, where we will have to figure out what we want to do about it and whether we want to explicitly recognize a leadership group before it's resolved on its own terms. I'm less worried about that one. I'm more worried about what happens if people who've been involved in street level violence or other violent crime connected to the election result think about crossing the border as a way of evading the police or linking up with other groups. And then that sets up the possibility that we have to make difficult choices about cooperating with American law enforcement to support them in prosecuting those people, or even have state or Canadian government law enforcement engage with these groups, like attempting to at the very least keep track of them, but even more serious attempt to make arrests or things like that. And then, of course, there's the much larger problem of what to do about the kind of contagion effects where some of these ideas inevitably leak over the border and encourage like-minded groups in Canada, and they want to pursue similar kinds of anti-government efforts in Canada. And it's difficult to know, in the era of the internet, what, if anything, we could do in a meaningful way, at least in the short term, to prevent that from happening. Kind of extreme escalation of those kinds of anti-government movements in Canada, as a result of them being encouraged by violence and conflict in the U.S. So all of these things, on for the trade file and the defense file, there are these things that are kind of going forward, and the question is, how will they be disrupted by uncertainty about the result? And on these other issues about kind of national security, non-traditional national security challenges, that there is also an ongoing thing, and that is the ongoing sort of breakdown of democratic institutions and of sort of basic law and order functions in the U.S. And the question is whether that can be contained by a clean Biden win, or whether those problems are going to continue to manifest themselves. And then, the question of what, if anything, we can do on the Canadian side to prevent U.S. trouble from finding its way to Canada.
Thank you. We have about 15 minutes left. So what I think we can do is I'll return to every one of our panelists and kind of ask them kind of closing thoughts moving forward that would hopefully inform the Q&A as well. And I'll keep the same order. So Meredith, in closing thoughts, I think what we're seeing here in the Canada-U.S. relationship, but elsewhere, is the impact of COVID seems to be leading countries to more protectionist measures, or at least a more protectionist message, now knowing whether it's going to translate to measure is something else. What do you foresee? What do you foresee with this in this trend moving forward? And do you think is the best way for Canada to navigate these waters? But also, how will Canada then shift in this direction as well, right? What can we expect from our own government facing the United States or Mexico or its other multilateral trade agreements that it signed recently elsewhere?
Thanks for that. Yes, I think we are seeing an increase in protectionism, but I don't think COVID caused it. I think COVID is a bit of the gasoline on the fire kind of thing. We've seen for several years now nationalist economic movements in the United States, in China through its Made in China 2025 initiative, a little bit in India via Make in India, although it has a different flavor and welcomes foreign investment. We've seen kind of cracks in continuing globalization for a while. I think COVID certainly has amplified all of that, especially in the area of essential supplies. And so when I think about what Canada needs to do, I mean, we're a trading nation. We, unlike the United States and China and India, do not have a large enough domestic market to just simply put up orders and make things in Canada for Canadians. And so it's essential for us to continue to work to find ways to support kind of the international rules-based order around these things. Having said that, I do think we need to be a little bit more focused on our own national interest. I think it's clear that we can perhaps expect less from other countries, particularly the United States. I do think the time has arrived that we need to pick sides on the China-U.S. trade dispute. This is something that was we were squeezed into that position during NAFTA renegotiations via the clause that was in there around non-market economies, this idea that we would have to sort of ask the Americans permission or notify the Americans if we were going to sign with a non-market economy. So it's been there for a while, but there's broad bipartisan interest in continuing sort of this tough on China stance, and Vice President Biden has been very vocal about this, including in last night's debate, where he continued to kind of say, we need to keep going after China. And so one of the real concerns that I have moving forward under either a Trump or a Biden win is that if this Buy America trend is going to continue, it's essential that Canada is not seen as sort of stuck in the middle, like Andrea mentioned this as well, that Canada can end up getting a little bit stuck. And while we might want to stay out of the US-China dispute, the reality is I think we're going to have to pick sides because we can't afford to alienate the Americans. So when they get concerned about things like steel overproduction and Canada being a way to flood the American market, this is something that's actually in Biden's platform. I think that we have to navigate that very carefully. I think I've seen in the last couple of weeks a real change in tone out of the Canadian government around China. So perhaps they're already fully aware of the need to do this. Our ambassador to the UN, Bob Ray, did not mince words over the last week or two about the position of the two Michaels. And we also saw Prime Minister Trudeau make some very strong statements, stronger than I have seen for years. And so I think perhaps there's some awareness that the gloves are off a little bit and we can't continue to kind of skate this issue. So that I think will be one of the big changes that we need to be aware of. And then finally, I think, the post-COVID trading world is going to look different. So I do think Canada needs to take stock of what our comparative advantage is in a post-COVID world. What are the essential goods that we're not willing to do without again? And who will our kind of reliable trading partners be in a more protectionist global climate moving forward?
Thank you very much. And this is the arrival of China on the topic, I think, is a great segue for Andrea to also give us her final thoughts on on the security threats that Canada and the U.S. will see, continue to see moving forward, but the way that Canada is going to handle them. Russia is not going away, especially with the Arctic issue. Same for China, and its rise is continuing. How do you foresee all of this moving forward, and how Canada will engage with that? But depending on who is in the White House for the United States.
Well, I think China, especially, who is now a peer competitor to the United States, is really difficult to deal with, because on the one hand, it's growing in military capability, but we're still unclear about intentions. There are some times when Xi, especially his speech in the General Assembly recently, if you closed your eyes and didn't know who was speaking, you would think this is somebody from the West. I mean, calling on the world, let's deal with climate change together. We all need to reduce our greenhouse gases. On the other hand, we know that China is very good at fomenting dissent, has grand plans to eventually have a say in terms of sea lanes of communication, and for the United States, which is used to being able to sort of dictate the rules to the world, this is really, really unnerving. And as Meredith mentioned, you know, Canada is going to have to determine how we deal with China, but also keep in mind the deep vulnerability the United States feels. We see this already in our defense policy, strong, secure, and engaged. We don't call out China as an adversary. We don't call out Russia as an adversary either. It's somebody we need to watch and worry about. Very different language from the US, which, you know, calls them adversaries, and military doctrine is shifting towards how are we going to deter these great powers. Canada realistically can aid, contribute, but cannot on its own militarily go toe-to-toe with China and Russia. So I think we're going to see that Canada is going to be doing two things. On the one hand, making sure that it is still a good military ally, keeping its foot firmly in the NORAD door and also in the NATO door. But on the other hand, being a supporter of all the multilateral institutions, especially things like the Arctic Council, which tends to take the military edge off of discussions and issues, and still try and work with Russia and China in issue areas where it makes sense, and we're getting positive outcomes and support for international law and order.
Thank you very much, Andrea. And well then, it's going big picture then, but for a similar theme. We've heard this over and over again, I think, in commentaries, and it's this shift, or the seeming shift, towards more authoritarianism in the United States during the current administration, but even dating back to the prior. Do you think this is something that we're going to see more of in case of a re-election by Donald Trump? But I'm also kind of interested in your thought as, are there some of these changes that we've experienced that a Democrat administration may be willing to actually keep?
Yeah, I mean, yes, there are. I think what we're seeing is there is a kind of global shift toward authoritarianism, and it's sort of manifested in a bunch of places like Hungary and Turkey and the Philippines, where authoritarianism has taken hold, and is largely because of the kind of dislocating effects of economic globalization, kind of unmanaged climate change, second order effects, and kind of growing in political inequality and a feeling of disenfranchisement by a lot of people. And all of these things have led to a kind of frustration that the system doesn't seem to work for lots of people anymore, and authoritarianism seems like a kind of like this is our gamble to get us out of the hole. And a lot of those same feelings, I think, played an important part in electing Trump in 2016. And I think that, that there is a deep authoritarian streak in American society in the same way that there is in lots of other countries as well. And Canada is also dealing with some of those things, maybe not on the same level, but there are certainly people who also feel like disenfranchised and frustrated with the system and who see, a desire for strong leadership and those kinds of things, strong anti-immigrant or scapegoating impulses, all of those kinds of phenomena. So there is a kind of a wobbliness, I guess, of liberal democracy right now, and there are groups who are sort of looking to turn the system over and see if they can get out from under it and maybe even sort of take over. And authoritarianism seems like a vehicle for doing that. And I think the big question mark, I guess, about all of that is we're kind of hit by two things at the same time. We have these huge global problems like climate change that need strong, capable states to work together to resolve them. And at that same moment, we're having this sort of parallel crisis of the state in lots of different leading countries at the same time. And so we have the threat and we have our capacity to respond effectively to it, our sort of this is getting worse and this is getting worse at the same moment. And I think that there's a lazy tendency, I think, for a lot of Canadians to feel like we're kind of the virtuous exception to all of these things and none of these things touch us and we have somehow escaped from them all. And we haven't escaped from either one of them. I mean, the reality is that there's not much we can do on our own, and if we don't work really hard to connect up with other relatively stable liberal democracies to push for some kind of coordinated global plan to respond to climate change, we're going to get just as messed up by it as everybody else. And at the same time, we have those same kind of problems stemming from inequality and perceived disenfranchisement and all of those things, anti-immigrant, immigrant sentiments, all of those things are also sort of shaking the foundation of democracy in Canada at the same time. And so this is kind of an emergency moment. And just because we haven't seen the ugliest versions of this manifesting themselves in Canada does not mean we can be complacent about any of it. And, the results of the election in the U.S. matter a lot for the resolution of these things, because I feel like our prospects of turning things around are slightly better with the Biden-Harris administration, but still we are not out of the woods just because of whatever happens on November 3rd. See, I told you it was going to be bleak.
Thank you very much for that. And I'd like to take a second to say thank you for all three of our panelists to agree to be here today. It was fantastic. So we have 30 minutes left, 31 minutes left to be quite exact. And I'm patting myself on the back for amazing time management. I'm going to open the floor to question, and I also want to give you our panelists a chance. I'm going to ask you the first question, but if you would like to pick up a theme that one of the other panelists picked up and I did not throw back at you, to please do so before answering the question so we can get everybody's hot take. We've discussed this, but I want to ask the question because you may have other thoughts that you wanted to add to this. EO asked, how might the impacts to Canada change as a result of the U.S.-China relationship, depending on who wins? Thank you. And I'm going to let you decide who wants to go at that. Oh, Meredith, yes.
Sure. Well, since I already talked about China, I won't say more of what I've already said, but one piece that I did not add was that Biden has said in his in last night's debate and in written platform documents that under a Biden presidency, there would be a real effort to work with allies in other countries on a multilateral approach to China. And that's something that I support and think is actually the only option for Canada. As Andrea said, on the defense front, Canada really can't go it alone on almost anything, but it certainly can't go it alone with respect to China. And so participating in a multilateral group that wants to, work with China constructively in areas where we can work constructively, but also recognizes that some of the ambition is cause for real concern, and finds a global approach to address those things, I think is really the only way forward.
Thank you. Brian or Andrea?
Yeah, I add just a little bit to that. And one of the crucial things in all of this is if the U.S. wants to go about building a kind of, I don't want to say coalition because that makes it seem more confrontational than it necessarily would be, but a kind of a cooperative network of countries who are trying to coordinate their responses to China. The pivotal thing in all of that is going to be to maintain the confidence of those smaller partners for the U.S. And the Trump administration has squandered whatever goodwill the U.S. had stored up at that point. So this is really kind of like the position the U.S. was in 2008, 2009, that they have to start the process of rebuilding their credibility and their relationships virtually from scratch. And there are going to be bumps along the road in doing that. Whereas in other times when the U.S. is trying to build a network of support, they're asking countries to do things like spend more on defense. And those are, there are guns and butter trade-offs that are politically difficult, but the kinds of things that the U.S. would have to be doing now or asking states to do now are things like, exclude China from investing in particular sectors of the economy, or hand over, Chinese business executives who happen to be traveling through Canada or things like that. These are things that kind of cut more closely to domestic political questions and which kind of impinge more on a country's feeling of sovereign autonomy, essentially. And therefore, they're much more politically sensitive and they are more likely to kind of trigger a reaction. And if the U.S. hasn't done a lot of work to build up credibility and political capital with these allies, those efforts are going to fizzle and the cooperation is not going to happen.
Thank you.
I would just
enjoy that.
Yeah, I would just say when it comes to China, I think we're all going to rediscover sanctions in a big way, and where Trump has to be commended, he has put sanctions against China, for activity against minorities like the Uyghurs. Canada has not, and you would think it would be the reverse. And so I think that Canada is really going to have to accept that if there are some issues on which it cannot compromise, then it's going to suffer consequences from China. And the government has to be out front and open and say, we are prepared to take these hits because we think, for example, that the systematic abuse of minorities cannot happen. Trump has managed to do this. It'll be interesting to see if Biden continues on that path, but I think everybody should get to know sanctions because they're going to play a big role in the future.
Thank you. I have a question here that is likely more targeted toward Brian, but I would invite Andrea and Meredith to answer too if they wish. MJ asked, what are the probability that post-election violence protests spill in Canada and materialize as protest violence against Canadian government officials and infrastructure?
I mean, the answer is we don't know. That's a big question, and we can't know. And that part of the reason we can't know is because the mechanism for that happening is not the same kind of thing that it would have been 50 or 100 years ago. It doesn't have to be, people from the U.S. traveling to Canada and linking up with people and building networks to support these things. The internet has a different mechanism for radicalizing people. Means that it's much harder to kind of keep track of these effects, and it's almost impossible to kind of block them from happening. So the bigger issue is going to be finding ways to protect potential targets and finding ways to, where there are coordinated activities and people are doing things like forming militia groups or something, to have the RCMP kind of tracking them and trying to, disrupt them. But the reality is that it's some of that is going to happen on some level. And it could be just, somebody goes down and into a wormhole, gets radicalized, and, gets a gun and takes things into their own hands. And it's extremely difficult for law enforcement to do anything to anticipate that before it happens. I guess the question is how much of that will happen? I don't know. I think partly it depends on how bad things get in the U.S. If there's a contested election, I think it's much more likely to get bad in the U.S. and therefore much more of the kind of messaging that would radicalize Canadians is going to come across the border. Many of the potential groups for this already exist. And Canadian law enforcement tries to keep track of them and to disrupt their activities and that kind of thing. But it is a moving target and inherently difficult to control.
Thank you. Okay, good. Then I have likely a follow-up asked by Sarah Goldfeather. I think it would be helpful in discussing the role of the Supreme Court to discuss what kind of questions would be adjudicated by that body. They're not going to be asked to decide a question on the results themselves, for example. What can we say to this?
Yeah, I did forget to unmute myself. There's many different possibilities. So yes, there's not going to be a question that comes before the court that says who wins, right? Just like there wasn't in 2000. What there will be instead is a question about whether particular votes should be counted or not, whether particular votes were counted correctly, whether particular acts of what are essentially fraud, but not kind of voter fraud in the sense of somebody votes twice kind of thing, but somebody made a vote suppression effort that undermined the count in a particular place, like disinformed people about where the polling stations were or how the polling was going to work, that kind of thing. We already have Republican groups in California that set up fake ballot box collection sites and things like that. So all of those kinds of things. And of course, none of them are going to be worth contesting unless the result in a particular state is very close, just like in Florida. It has to be a very close result where you could see that, whatever interference could actually impact the overall result for that state. So there has to be a kind of a perfect storm of different things, but there are several states that are very close right now, and there's lots of different math by which you could get one outcome or the other. So there are lots of potential spaces where you could conceivably have a contested outcome and it sort of makes its way up to the courts, through the court system. Having said that, the number of times this has actually happened in the US is very low. There was one in the late 19th century and then there's 2000, that's basically it, right? So this is not inherently likely, but nowadays there are so many different kinds of challenges to the electoral system taking place simultaneously that I wouldn't be at all surprised if we had a court challenge in one state context or another.
Thank you. I believe this question is more directed towards Andrea, and Montana Hunter asked, do you think Trump and Biden would approach NORAD modernization differently?
That's a great question. NORAD modernization, we tend to automatically think this is only and exclusively about the North Warning System renewal. But NORAD modernization can be seen as something that's happened with, several NORAD commanders going back. A recognition that threats now don't stay in one domain. NORAD is very used to having an air threat and defeating that air threat and not having to consider, well, what happened if this had a cyber component, or perhaps there's a land component, or even now a maritime component. And so NORAD modernization is really a response to the changing threats in the world, changing actors in the world. And so it's really not tied to whether it's, you know, Trump or Biden who is in the White House. It really is a reflection of the military, both Canada and the US, that they were configured to respond to what was potentially going to threaten North America in 1957 when it was up and operational, as opposed to now. Now we have a cyber component that we need to worry about, and how does that fit into the NORAD mission suites. So I don't think you're going to see a change in approach. It might just be convincing Congress, and that'll be the key, that money can be spent on this initiative. And I think whereas Trump will always be convinced that defending the homeland, which is synonymous with NORAD, is money well spent, Biden may be pulled to provide more collective security-like action elsewhere. And given COVID and shrinking budgets, we may see less money earmarked for NORAD. Thanks.
Thank you. I have a question that is for Brian and Meredith. I'm unmuted. Okay. How would Canada manage its border in light of violent unrest in the U.S.? Are you anticipating a flow of people seeking refuge? How would or should Canada handle that?
I have a couple of thoughts on this. So am I anticipating a level of violence that would result in refugees coming to Canada? It's out of my bailiwick in terms of assessing the likelihood of that occurring. But there are a lot of things that would have shocked me 4 years ago that now I think as Canadians we have to anticipate and at least spend some time thinking about unlikely scenarios. And so I have every confidence that our border officials, government officials are actually thinking about these very questions. In terms of thinking about the actual result, though, I think if there's a likelihood of a Biden win, individuals whose status in the United States has been threatened over the last 4 years have a lot of reasons to stay in the United States. And so potentially, if it looks like things are headed towards a Trump either keeping power, seizing power, or actually a win, then potentially. But I think more important around all of that is Canada's Supreme Court ruling around striking down the Safe Third Country Agreement, which is playing itself out right now in Canada. And so there actually will be a shift in terms of what happens when people show up at not an official border crossing in the next little while. So that's an important issue, I think, to keep aware of. The only thing I would say, and this Besma had asked a similar question. The only thing I would say around real violence and a change to the threat level in the United States is that if there's actually a change in the threat level, that will have consequences on the Canadian border, and it could potentially disrupt the flow of trade and other things as well. So leaving aside the potential for refugees to be coming up from the United States, there will be real problems at the border getting things into Canada that we normally would want to have. And so being really mindful of that change in threat level and figuring out how we're going to handle it could potentially be an issue, and certainly is something that I think officials are probably spending time thinking about.
Thank you. Brian, did you want to add something?
Just a tiny thing. I think definitely government officials, Canadian officials are definitely thinking about these things, and they are entertaining extreme scenarios that they probably would have thought of as science fiction even a few years ago. I think the flood of refugees from the U.S. scenario is pretty extreme, though. I mean, things would have to get desperately bad there for that to be an issue. My concern for crossing of the border that we might not be ready for is less about huge hordes of people moving north than it is about a few people moving north or trying to get back and forth across the border to evade law enforcement or to link up with people in order to commit some kind of cross-border crime to finance illegal activity in the U.S. And that is not a new thing. That's sort of people cross the border with shady motives all the time. So it's really kind of just would be a quantitative increase in the kind of resources that would have to be put into border control. There are ways in which, if people are trying to move people illegally over the border through sort of normal ports, then that could lead to new security measures that would slow the traffic down at the border, and that would become an issue, and there'd have to be a lot more coordination between Canadian and American officials to kind of smooth things out at the border. I'm more thinking about this as if there's going to be a real problem connected to violence, people are not going to be using regular border crossings. They're going to be trying to cross in the middle of nowhere, and that's a different kind of border control challenge.
Thank you. And I forgot to mention that this question came from Christopher Ankerson. I have a question here from Adam McDonald.
Sorry, Jean-François, can I just comment on this? Because I think in the background, I think looming is, well, what about calling in the military? And it's different on both sides of the border, but one of the things I think will be interesting to watch is the extent to which governors in a state where the decision of the vote is different from what the state thought should be the winner, you're going to see a call for the National Reserve, the U.S. National Reserve, to be called in. And we've seen under the Trump administration a very heavy-handed approach to using quasi-military-like authorities and using the national reserves to sort of quash and quell violence, when really this is a constabulary function. This really should be handled by police and security agencies who have officer powers. So I'll be watching for that in the United States. In Canada, as Meredith mentioned, all departments will be thinking through scenarios. The Department of Defense will be no different, and they will be brushing up on the difference between aid to the civil power, which is under the National Defense Act, which is in the case of an insurrection or violence, which I don't think we're anticipating. And then assistance to civil authorities, such as perhaps border officials might need more boots on the ground just to help assist. Military cannot process people crossing the border. They have none of those authorities, but it is perhaps helpful if federal departments feel overwhelmed, to have somebody, the military, helping with perhaps traffic congestion and things like that. But again, the military can't just decide one day, well, it looks like we're needed, let's go. There is a definite process, and it requires the authority and consent of the executive. It's not that the military can just decide we're going to go in both sides of the border.
I'll keep you with me 1 second, because Besma is asking a question that's that's dovetailing on this very well. And she asked, if election results are contested and violence in U.S. ensue, what could we expect Canadian defense community to do and respond to reinforce the undefended border and so on? So you think that's mostly the view from the U.S. Now, could you pivot us more to the Canadian view to this?
Well, the Canadian military can do nothing until there's a formal request and then an acceptance by the Chief of the Defense Staff that they have those capabilities and capacity to assist. I think the question that Meredith raised about parts of the border where we don't have official crossings could be interesting, because we do know that our police are quite thin on the ground, and we always have, you know, a problem of resources. But again, this would be in a very controlled fashion where an official request has to be made either by the province or the Attorney General to the federal government, and then consent by the Chief of the Defense Staff. And it's usually in terms of capabilities that are requested, as opposed to, we would like the Army in this specific brigade. It's not at that finite level.
Thank you very much. I have a question from Adam McDonald, returning to similar themes. If there's an inconclusive disputed election result beyond November 3rd, will there be pressure by either the Trump or Biden camps to try to get or incentivize other countries to recognize them as the winner? And if so, what shouldn't Canada do? I'll let any of you that wants to jump first to this question. I think Brian has a hand.
I will take a shot at it. So, I mean, the answer is there will be a kind of a hope, I guess, by whichever party is feeling like it needs that support. I mean, obviously, whether Peru or Kazakhstan or whatever recognizes you makes no difference in terms of the kind of direct political consequence, but there is a way in which it might make a difference to American voters if it seems like there's a clear tilt, you know, like if foreign governments are tilting one way or the other. I don't think it would be a big difference, and I think that it's not likely to make much of a difference either to political outcomes or to the calculus of any of the various leaderships in other countries. But I do think there will be some countries in the world where they're sort of like, we want to stay on good terms with Trump. Signaling our support for him and saying that we think he won would be a way of kind of staying in or getting into his good book. So we might try that out. But I think it would be a real circus sideshow, and it would be the countries that would do that would not be big and important countries, let's say. Or key partners for the U.S. I think they would be smaller countries that maybe know a little bit less about how U.S. politics work.
I would just add, sorry, Andrea, I saw you as well, that I do think there might be a little bit of pressure on the Trudeau government to comment in favor of a Biden campaign. I don't think it would be wise, and it would largely be playing to a domestic audience in Canada. It's a very much speaking to the converted sort of message. So I don't think it would be the best idea to do that, but I think the pressure will be there. I mean, in the last election, President Obama endorsed Prime Minister Trudeau, and so there is a history there. There was a history of closeness between the Hillary Clinton campaign and the Trudeau office as well, where they thought that the conclusion was so foregone that they should just kind of get everyone in place. And so I think it's important to be very careful. Having said that, if there's an overwhelming clear result and we're seeing behavior in the United States that in normal circumstances other countries would comment, then perhaps there might be some kind of multilateral statement made about what they think the result is. But generally, it doesn't serve Canadian interests and mostly just makes Canadians feel good when we talk about American elections.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. I would only add that I hope that the party whips put a gag order on all members of Parliament, opposition members, and the current government. You are mute on this topic until it's clear that something should be said. And I worry that, you know, partisan jabs will be brought up in the House of Commons to sort of try and goad the current government to make a definitive statement. And that just undermines national interests. So please everybody in the House of Commons, this is just keep your mask on, and for many good reasons, but especially so as not to inadvertently say something inappropriate.
Well, it seems that we have a EO that actually wants the three of you to do the actual opposite and commit, asking the following question: do you think Canada would benefit better from one candidate or the other? Natural affinities and personalities notwithstanding, meaning benefit economically, militarily, politically. I can stay with you, Andrea, if you wish, or I can move to the other two panelists.
You know, that's a really great question. And from a defense perspective, I'm going to say no. I think we may think that Biden is going to make our lives so much easier, but as difficult a president as Trump has done, the one thing he has done in the defense world is forced every country to take a good hard look at their defense priorities, how they do it, looking at their capabilities. And it's been, I think, finally the impetus to realize how vulnerable and dependent we have been. And so I think in many ways that the Trump presidency has been very helpful to defense analysts, as much as they may not want to admit that. I think he's uncovered a lot of what doesn't work in a liberal world order. And so we should learn from those lessons.
Thank you. Brian, Meredith, Brian?
I'm happy to defer to Meredith, but I didn't see her hand go up. So, I mean, I'm going to go ahead and disagree. I mean, I do agree with Andrea's point that there have been some things that have been kind of brought to our attention by the Trump administration, and it's good for us to think about those things. But I think in general, a Trump re-election is bad for Canada, mostly because it's really bad for the U.S. And it's Canada is tied on to the U.S., whether we like it or not. And when things go bad in the U.S., they go bad for us too. And I think the two main reasons to have a strong preference from the Canadian side of the border are because it seems like the Trump administration is absolutely unwilling to do anything about the two biggest challenges of the day, climate change and COVID-19. And that is sort of bad for the United States and ultimately will be bad for us. And two, because he seems to be undermining American democracy, and that is, you know, there's no immediate threat that stems from that, but in the long term, it's very bad for the U.S. and I would make the argument it's very bad for the world more general.
I would agree with Brian that that ultimately a Biden presidency would be better for Canada, that there are specific policy positions under Biden that are not great for Canada. Trade is not great. The Keystone Pipeline is not great for Alberta in particular. That hasn't come up before now. So there are some specific policy positions that really are not in Canada's narrow interest. But I think that Biden represents a better option for the planet, not just for the Canada-U.S. relationship, but I think globally. And, you know, the question that was asked said, let's leave aside personalities, but unfortunately, I don't think you can leave aside President Trump's personality. And so another piece of this is that Canada is in a stronger position multilaterally when we have a good relationship with the United States. And we have more influence on the world stage when we have a strong relationship with the United States. Right now, that is not the case. So I think there's a number of reasons that a Biden presidency would be better, but it's no panacea. There are some specific aspects of his platform. We also haven't talked at all about how it might play out under different congressional kind of breakdowns. But if there's a very strong progressive left-wing rank under Biden, some of that could be negative for us.
All right, well, thank you very much. That was all the time that we've had. We are at 1:30 on the dot. I would like to say thank you to all three of our panelists, Meredith, Brian, Andrea. Thank you very much for being with us this afternoon. And thank you to the audience, and we'll see you soon. I don't have the listing of the event here, but I do know we have another webinar planned for the near future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.